Day 44 to 3:25 a.m. Mountain Base, Mount Malabito, General Nakar, Quezon. Mark sat on the edge of his bed as he tried to recover him calm. Around him were Amihan, all the blood children, and Miracle, who was currently switched consciousness with Aphelia. Your Majesty, breathe deeply. It is better for your Majesty to calm down. Aphelia spoke. Fortunately, Miracle's cute voice that came out as she spoke had better effect in this. On the other hand, Amihan was flying beside Mark's head silently while patting his hair. The blood children that surrounded Mark were also worried. Mark had just experienced another episode of painful suffering. It was because of his empathic abilities recovering. This time, however, it was not just like the previous one. The pain he felt in his head was about twice or thrice stronger if compared. Even the very first one that happened and even called that phenomenon was not as painful as this one. More than that, he suffered for 3 whole hours. All that while, everyone here had been watching him with worry, since they could not ask anyone for help as this was one of Mark's secrets. All Aphelia and Amihan could do was to wipe the sweat on his face and neck. Just before Mark woke up, however, he started to release a thick bloodlust from his body. It was too thick that everyone in this room felt it despite the fact that the bloodlust was not targeted to them. If they were just normal people, they might have felt suffocated. Despite the thick bloodlust, however, none of them left or even stepped back. They all knew that Mark would not harm them in the slightest. Instead, they felt worry about what was happening. None of them even realized that outside, the clouds were moving oddly. A kilometer-wide ring of clouds could be seen with the moon at the center. The inner parts of the ring of clouds swayed and vanished as if being sucked at the center. The moment that Mark woke up, the ring of clouds vanished at the same time. Only Mark knew what really happened. This time, Mark had fully recovered his empathic ability. Not only that it recovered but was even stronger to a certain degree. Right now, his ability to detect and absorb emotions of people could cover the whole base, that there were still extra areas outside. However, the thing that Freed warned him about started happening. As his empathic abilities were strengthened, so as the concentration of emotions he could absorb. If this was not regulated properly, it would start to affect his mental state. Luckily, his subconscious trait was emptiness, and most of these emotions were sucked into nothingness. It would be harder for these concentrated energies to fully consume him. The only thing he needed to mind was that the thicker the emotion and mental energy affecting his mind, the longer it took to be cleared and sucked away. However, what was the reason he released that amount of bloodlust? It was because while he was suffering in pain and his mental abilities recovering, his clairvoyance kicked in. However, it was different this time. Not only that he saw the future, he was even given the scene of the past. He was there. At the meeting, watching. Every single word they said, he heard it clearly. Rather than seeing the past, it was more accurate that his soul traveled into the past to actually witness what happened several hours before. Unfortunately, he had no control towards what he was going to see. If he could, he would have tried to find May and the others to see how they were doing. After witnessing the whole meeting, he was subjected to the scene where he failed to arrive on time or did not arrive at all. He saw where all of them died. It was all due to the machinations done behind the scenes. There was no way that he would let that sort of thing happen. It will be the total opposite. Your Majesty, here is the towel. Aphelia said as she was about to hand a towel to Mark. Thanks. Mark replied and tried to take the towel. He then froze. There was no towel where he stretched his hand towards and grabbed nothing but air. No, he was not mistaken. He saw the towel being handed to him, but Aphelia has yet to fully stretch her small hands holding the folded towel towards Mark. Not only Mark but also Amihan and Aphelia felt strange seeing that. Especially Aphelia when she saw Mark had already tried to grab something in the place where she was supposed to place her hands as she handed the towel. What is going on? Mark waved his right hand in front of his eyes. He saw 2 hands moving towards the same direction. It was just one of the hands appeared several seconds before he moved his actual hand. This, my lord, maybe, because of your eyes. Amihan voiced what she was able to see. Ophelia on the other hand had not realized it until Emihan said it. It was because of her mannerisms as Freed's personal maid. It was impertinence as a royal maid to directly look at their king's face. That was why she tried not to do it most of the time and looked down as she spoke to Mark. Hearing what Emihan said, Mark sluggishly stood up and took a compact mirror from his work table. As someone who was not blessed in terms of facial appearance, he did not like to look on a mirror. However, he needed to see what was happening this time. On his reflection on the mirror, he saw his eyes. His pupils were glowing in a bright purple color. It was very different from the usual red chilling glow. It was also different from Carla's eyes that seemed to be covered in light. It was really strange. Not to mention that everything that moved in his eyes had two figures. The first one was quite blurry or transparent while the second figure was solid. He was having a hard time due to this. There was also the sensation of feeling drained while it was ongoing. In front of his work table, he put down the mirror and started to relax his body. He closed his eyes, emptied his thoughts and breathed deeply and in regular intervals. The next moment he opened his eyes, everything turned to normal. He looked at the mirror once more and the glow in his eyes was already gone. The feeling of being drained was still there, but it had already stopped from worsening. A new ability. Mark clenched his right hand in realization. "Congratulations, Your Majesty," Ophelia voiced as she heard what Mark said. She also realized why Mark was behaving rather strange. "Your Majesty, is it perhaps flash precognition?" the royal maid in a child's body asked. It made Mark quite surprised. "You can tell?" "Yes, Your Majesty. I realized due to Your Majesty's actions earlier. You're as perceptive as ever. This humble servant is gratified for Your Majesty's praise." Mark looked at Ophelia with annoyed eyes. Of course, what he could see was Miracle's body. "My apologies. I know what Your Majesty is thinking, but I would not change it." Ophelia looked at Mark with resolute eyes which made him shrug his shoulders. Mark really wanted Ophelia to stop being too formal, but the maid would not accept it no matter what. "Really, just what did Freed feed you to be like this?" He could only give up as he said those words. Turning his head towards the small window he made in this room, he could see the dark sky of the night. This was the day he would set out to finally meet his new family once more. Still, there was something bothering him. Why did he not arrive in time in his premonition? Mark turned his head towards the wall and slapped his forehead. Miliel that was on the other side of the room was shivering in fright. For sure, she also felt that intense bloodlust he subconsciously released after witnessing those scenes in his dream. He had no choice but to go out to the next room and appease her. Day 44 to 6:42 a.m. Mountain Base, Mount Malabito, General Nakar, Quezon. Morning arrived and Mark did not manage to return to sleep after he appeased the scared mermaid with a lot of effort. As many different thoughts running in his mind, it would be surprising if he was able to. In the end, he tried to grasp the new ability he suddenly had. It was quite hard to grasp and was too taxing to maintain, but he managed to get some insights from it. Flash precognition. It was a branching ability of clairvoyance. While clairvoyance could allow a person to peek into the future or past events, flash precognition would allow someone to see at least a split second into the future. As Mark could only see a second and a half before the actual action happened, he ended up seeing two figures doing the action, especially if the action was made slow or the movement was too little. An ability that was both weak and strong at the same time. Compared to the main ability, it was weak, but if used properly, it was strong. In the least, Mark could control its activation. He never expected to gain something like this at this moment. It was new evidence that Mutagen could strengthen and bolster an already existing psychic ability. Although he could not control the clairvoyance he inherited from his mother and could only manage to peek into the future at times something severe was about to happen, he was given this new one. He had yet to grasp the full extent of his current abilities and he was given another one. He had to work on it even harder. Inside the room, Mark started to prepare. Wearing his armor, checking his equipment and picking up the bags he prepared beforehand. He also had to help Miracle, who was struggling to wear her armor and dress. In an hour or so, he would leave. The ones coming with him this time aside from Miracle and Amihan was Colleen and Edsel. There was also the usual set of blood children that was composed of Oracle, Crimson and Ivy. This time, however, Alaula, the glowing blood child, was also coming along. Miracle and Amihan, along with the 3 blood children, coming along was already a given. For the other 3, there was a reason. Mark decided to start training Edsel, and one of the best ways for that was to make him fight the infected. Since Mark was going to the city, there were a lot of chances to do that. Colleen, on the other hand, needed to be monitored. After all, only Mark could control her alter ego, Carla. It would be a disaster if Carla suddenly broke out while Mark was gone. Although she would not hurt the people the infected Mark was keeping would be in danger. As for Alaula, Mark really had no plan to bring her since she was needed to install appropriate lighting around the base. However, she would not behave at all with others around. She was too hard-headed despite her gelatinous body and would only behave around Mark. Without Mark, the installation would not progress either. Sign that was the case, Mark decided to bring her. He could only pray that the other blood children would not imitate her in order to come with him. It would be a whole lot of trouble not only to him but also for the base, since they were the main source of construction materials for the base. With everything in set, Mark and his entourage was ready to go. Everyone in the base gathered outside the southern gates to see them go. Alana and Colleen said goodbyes to each other, and the latter threatened Mark to take care of her friend. Huey, Jolene, Hallie and Nicole assured their leader that they would take care of the base while they were gone, while the others and even the children waved as Mark and the others flew unto the sky while riding on Schaffler's back. Their first stop was the new Northeast Quezon settlement. Day 44 to 6:55 a.m. Mount Malabito, General Nakar, Quezon. At the sky above the foot of the mountain northeast of the mountain base, a dragon flew with several people on its back. Of course, it was Schaffler who was serving as Mark's transport. With the dragon around, it became easier for Mark to traverse the distance that should have taken longer and harder. Since the base was at the slightly flatter area southeast part of Mount Malabito, it would normally take several hours just to hike down the mountain towards Agos River and go up the mountain range on the other side to reach Marikina Infanta Highway. From the highway, walking towards the new location of the military settlement would take several more hours. Not to mention the dangers that they would encounter on foot. Mark had already brought back the motorcycles he hid after eliminating the outlaws, but he had yet to find a place to park the vehicles near the road. Right now, their priority was developing the base, and structures all the way outside would have to wait for a while. On Schaffler's back, everyone sat neatly. A comfortable saddle had already been made on the dragon's back, which enabled 5 adults to ride. Schaffler's back was quite wider than the area of its shoulders. Due to that, the saddle was positioned in 1, 2 and 1 seating order. Not to mention that the saddle was connected to a carrier under Schaffler that could hold quite an amount of baggage. The first seat was occupied by Mark, and Miracle sat in front on him. Colleen occupied the second seat while Edsel was on the right seat behind Colleen. The 2 remaining seats were occupied by the bags Mark brought that should not be put under Schaffler for many reasons. Of course, Amihan was on Mark's shoulder as she used her powers to remove the air resistance as Schaffler flew as fast as possible. The morning air above the mountains was colder than the city. Colleen and Edsel still shivered even though they were already wearing jackets. Even though Amihan warded the air resistance and they could not feel any wind blowing hard, the temperature was still there. "Don't you 3 feel cold at all?" Colleen could not help but complain as she saw how Mark, Miracle and Amihan seemed to be unaffected by the cold temperature. In response to Colleen's question, Mark opened one of the canisters beside his backpack and let Crimson out. He then handed the blood child to Colleen. "Hold him tight and don't let him fall." Colleen was confused as to why Mark gave Crimson to her, but when she held the blood child, "He's warm," she could not help but rub Crimson on her face. Mark could feel that Crimson was troubled about this, but the poor blood child could only endure. On the other hand, Mark was quite pleased with how Edsel was behaving. Edsel knew that he was still not worthy of the same treatment as Colleen had and was enduring the cold without saying anything. It made Mark want to see how long he could endure. Back in the base, Edsel saw how different the people lived. They were wearing good clothes, they were well fed, and everyone did not emanate the same atmosphere most people in the Eastport settlement had. The people in the base could even smile, and the slaves that had already given up on living were starting to see a better future. Seeing those things, he could not help but think, what if I and Pearl lived here in the first place? She wouldn't have left me then. He could only shake his head when that thought came and the words he heard in his ears before resurfaced. That event was not anyone's fault but his, it was because of his weakness. During his stay in the base, Mark left Edsel in the care of Huey and the others. He saw the abilities of the first group in Mark's base firsthand. Eagerness, that was what he felt as he watched them. There were also times when Jolene would bring him to train and spar. Of course, he was pitifully trashed, although he was physically stronger than her. Yesterday, Hallie noticed his eyes as he watched another of Jolene's and Alana's spars. She gave him a few words. Jolene isn't that great before. She's even the weakest among us, she said, which surprised him. When he asked how she became strong, Hallie answered. She accepted being Mark's slave along with Huey. Along with her natural ability, she became strong with Mark's training. Hallie then looked at him. You and Jolene had the same eyes before, you know that? The same thirst to become strong. Mark brought you here, so as long as you follow him, you'll be strong in the future. After saying that, Hallie left and wanted to join the spar of Jolene and Alana. However, the two refused adamantly. It was because Hallie was already a mutator and a rather powerful one. They said that it was because of Mark that she became one. He could not help but anticipate the future, but now, he just had to show that he was worthy of it. Day 44 to 7:24 a.m. Barangay Banugao, Infanta, Quezon. It did not take long and they arrived at the new settlement. They saw evolved birds along the way, but they all avoided Chaflar and some even fled in fear. It made their travel even easier this time. As long as they did not encounter any infected capable of flight like giant flies or mosquitoes, they should be fine. Seeing the familiar dragon, the people of the new settlement did not create any fuss anymore. They had seen Chaflar several times this past days as Mark traveled several times for different purposes. Still, many people gathered to at least catch a glimpse of the legendary dragon that now existed before their eyes. Mark found it rather annoying though. As he landed, General Faustino and Major Bautista were already there waiting for them. After all, this meeting was already scheduled before and was of great importance. They needed Mark to bring several things to Bay City for both development and research. Another thing was they also needed Mark to bring back a few things from Bay City, especially some of the fruits of the research there. Normally, they could just transmit the things through radio by using encrypted messages, but with the members of international organization lurking around, they could not do that anymore. Actually, the berserk liquid that the Death Valley settlement was not only their research, but they were also trying to recreate the regeneration medicine, but just failed since Port of Real Settlement did not transmit any of their findings on the radio yet. It's good that you guys are here. I don't need to go anywhere else like your office or something, Mark said as he approached General Faustino. You don't really have anything else to do here, right? It will be better if we don't take too much of your time. The general replied with a smile as he personally handed 3 metal cases to Mark. This one is yours to keep, he added as he gave the 3rd case. All right, thanks. Mark accepted the metal cases. He already knew the contents of the cases, and the one given to him was a sample of berserk liquid and a copy of the research. It was one of the compensations he could get for this job, not to mention the copies of research from Bay City he would receive after he returned. Edsel, take these and put these in the carrier. He called Edsel and handed the 2 of the 3 metal cases. Edsel immediately complied and put the metal cases on the carrier under Chaflar's body. On the side, Colleen and her father were talking. After all, Colleen was going away where communication was currently impossible. Sir Mark. After Mark conversed with General Faustino, someone called unto him. Mark knew that they were here. Mr. Salvador. Do you have any business with me right now? Mark spoke. The person in front of him was the head of Salvador family, Darren Salvador. Just Darren is fine. Darren smiled. It's about our cooperation. Is something wrong? You see, we surveyed our properties yesterday, the plantation we had that is stated in the contract. The whole place is decimated and almost everything we planted was destroyed. So you are saying that you won't be able to uphold the terms stated in contract, right? Yes, unfortunately. Darren sighed. You have done us a huge favor back then and even gave yous a good amount of food for sustenance, but we don't have much to give you in return. Mark smiled. Darren was really an honest person. Instead of lying and prolonging the issue, he actually came here to tell the problem honestly. In the first place, Mark had no interest in those properties. He only wanted to use Annika's taming ability. That was why he was really not bothered about the plantation. Then, Darren made a bold declaration. That is why, if possible, our family will work under you from now on. Hearing that, not only Mark but the other people around were surprised, especially those that came from the Eastport settlement and were helped by the kindness of Salvador family. Their family already surrendered their status to the military and many people they hired already left them, not to mention that many died back then during the multiple battles they experienced while evacuating. With nothing left but themselves, the members of the Salvador family could only use their people to uphold their end of the contract. They did not know. Becoming Mark's people just would further deepen their debts. Still, Mark found it more convenient that they offered it themselves. Actually, he also wanted to recruit them, especially Annika. However, Mark could not bring them now as he was in a hurry. Then, can you wait for my return? Just a week or so and I will bring your family with me. A week, huh, no problem. Darren then held out his hand, which Mark received with a bit of annoyance. He still hated handshakes. Mark did not really stay long and left after their business were done and Colleen finished her farewell with her father. Major Bautista also made Mark promise to take care of his daughter well in this journey. Colleen was really loved by the people close to her. As they took off, Mark could not help but feel something strange, it as if something changed, something he could not explain. Then, he realized, if he did not see the premonition last night, he would not hurry this much and might have immediately brought the Salvador family to his base. That would surely take more time. It was one of the things that should have made me delayed, isn't it? It would surely not be the last one. He murmured as he turned his head, looking at the corner of one of the school buildings. There was quite a tint of pity in his eyes. Asterisk 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 behind one of the school buildings. A girl in her teens watched the dragon flew away. She was emaciated and her body was filled with scars. The clothing she was wearing was old and dirty. It was obvious that the injuries she acquired happened not long ago, as her scars were rather new. Her fair skin looked coarse now, and a knife wound that went from her forehead, between her eyes and to her right cheek destroyed her face. She looked at the fading silhouette of the dragon with longing, guilt and regret in her eyes. Although she tried to hide it, the glistening drop of tear that fell down on her face could be seen. It seems you're doing well now. It is better for you to not see me like this. The girl murmured as she wiped her tears with her dirty sleeves. Without anyone noticing, she walked away back to where she belonged now. Together with the outcast slaves. Asterisk 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 Volume 5 End. Day 44 to 8 a.m. Lumutin, General Nakar, Quezon. After leaving the new military settlement, Mark and his group riding on Chaflar flew west, aiming to go over the mountains of General Nakar, Quezon. No matter which route they would take, it would be fraught with danger. Following the roads would likely make them encounter infected insects and birds, while flying over the mountains could lead to an encounter with evolved feral ones. In the latter's case, however, the number of evolved feral animals were lower compared to non-feral ones and the encounter would be less likely. That was why Mark took the latter route. This mountainous area is really large, isn't it? Colleen said while looking at the vast expanse of the mountainous area of General Nakar. Even though they were up in the sky, they could not see the full area of the forest and mountains. Of course, they were not flying above the mountain peaks and were just about a little more than half a kilometer from the ground. Flying over the mountain peaks would not be suitable for a travel like this due to the air being thin the higher the altitude of the flight. The mountainous area in General Nakar was really wide. It was more than 130,000 hectares, which was about 80% of the whole municipality of General Nakar, Quezon. Furthermore, 94% of the municipality was declared as forest lands. There were also 3 watersheds within the area. Food, water and construction materials. This place could supply all these things needed by their small base that only occupied more than 50 square meters and had less than 50 people. Not only was that, but the surrounding area outside of General Nakar also forested and mountainous areas. Since security was not an issue as long as everyone was within the base, they could live safely and comfortably here, without any lack of food and water, unlike the settlements where people were suffering. That is the direction to the base, right? Colleen spoke once more as she pointed at the south. She was like a child on a tour. Seriously, Mark shook his head hearing her words. It could not be helped though. He just wished that she would behave like Miracle and Edsel, who were just looking around silently. He also wished that Alaula also stopped being noisy in his head. The hard-headed, blood child, wanted to go out of her container. Luckily, they could not talk, or else it would be very annoying. The sun was rising up in the sky as time passed, making Colleen and Edsel feel more comfortable in this travel. While everyone else looked like tourists, Mark was keeping his vigilance in the surroundings. The things he saw in his premonition last night was still bugging him and making him unable to fully relax. He did not want to let down his guard and regret it. Say, Mark, are we going straight to Bay City? This is the right route, right? Colleen asked. It's not a straight route since we have to go around mountains and I'm not an expert in navigation. Even if we have a compass and a map, it will be hard to fly straight. Also, Chaflar could only fly for 2 hours straight and he needed to rest. Mark replied as he looked at the compass he was holding. It was something he got from the tourist spot during one of their supply runs before. Oh right. Colleen said as she patted one of Chaflar's scales. What Mark had just said made her remember. Chaflar was a living thing and its stamina was not infinite. Being able to fly about 2 hours straight was already amazing considering its size. Not to mention that it was carrying people and baggage. Because of the baggage, it would be possible that the time Chaflar could maintain flight would be lesser. They needed to make stops before they reached Bay City. Although Mark was in a rush, he did not want to push his pet to the limit or things might turn out worse than better. Of course, despite the expected stops, their travel speed was already fast. If they went on the ground either by foot or using a vehicle, it would be questionable if they could even reach a quarter of the distance they already traveled so far with the same time constraints. Not only that, but they would surely encounter a lot of danger and roadblocks to hinder them further. If they traveled on the road, just the distance from the new military settlement in Infanta to Bay City was already about 140 kilometers. That was a 3 hours 50 minutes travel before the outbreak if there was no traffic. With the traffic in EDSA, one of the most prominent roads in Metro Manila, those 3 hours would get consumed just to traverse the very well-known avenue. After the outbreak, however, it would surely be longer. It would not be surprising if it even took days to cover the whole distance. In any case, it was really convenient that Mark had Chaflar. ****** Day 44 to 8:42 a.m. San Jose, Antipolo, Rizal as expected. Chaflar did not even reach the 2-hour mark during this flight. It was not because he was weakened, but the unsteady flight as they avoided the mountains was also taxing. Chaflar was not a dragon that specialized in speed and flight, but a kind of destructive one. Since Mark had a mental connection with Chaflar, he could tell that the dragon was nearing its limit. The prideful lizard did not want to admit it though and wanted to keep going. Of course, that was not something that Mark could agree to. Without any choice, they had to find a good place to land and rest for a while. Even though they were still around the forested areas, they already traveled outside the border of General Nakar. According to the map Mark had, They should already be at the northeastern border of Antipolo, Rizal. Boss, how about there? Edsel, who rare spoke this time, suggested. He was pointing at a small town surrounded by forests and a river quite a distance away. Since Mark had no problems with that, he accepted the suggestion. They chose an open area beside the river and landed. Upon landing, Shaflar immediately lay down on the grass and closed its eyes. It knew that taking a nap would make it recover faster. After they land, Colleen walked towards the river to wash her face with the clear water. "Are you sure that you should be doing that?" Mark asked. "Why? This is still part of Agos River, you know. Who knows how many dead people this water drowned after the outbreak?" Yuga. Colleen realized that what she was about to do was dangerous and backed up immediately. Agos River was a very long winding river that crosses not only around the mountains of General Nakar but also at a few of the west, south and eastern municipalities surrounding General Nakar. Due to that, many villages and towns rely on the river for livelihood and supply. After the outbreak, however, it was questionable how many lives was taken by the river. There were a lot of possible causes for people to end up in the river after the outbreak. It might be because they fell, committed suicide or fell victim to evolved carnivorous fishes. In any case, it was never safe to use the river water unless it was at the source of the water. "Boss, I'll make some rounds," Edsel said. "All right, just yell if you encounter something you can't handle. Also don't stray far, we'll leave after an hour." Mark smirked as he saw Edsel scratch his head after hearing what he said. Edsel knew that he had been seen through. He was not just going for rounds but going to find something he could use for training. "Yes, boss." Mark and the rest watched Edsel walk away holding the sword Mark made for him and an assault rifle hanging on his back. "That guy is too eager, isn't he?" Colleen voiced her concerns after Edsel walked away. Even the childish her could tell that there was something wrong with Edsel. "Just let him be. He needs to learn a few things on his own, especially what he lacked." Mark replied. Edsel surely took his interest back then at Eastport Settlement, and because of his circumstances, it would be easy to get his loyalty. Mark was already sure about the latter issue, and Edsel was following his instructions properly by word. As for the interest, it was because Edsel's father was not human. The problem, however, was that Edsel was not worthy yet of receiving one of his precious crystals. Edsel was too eager and still needed to experience many things. He needed to realize what he lacked right now. That was the crucial thing. "Lack? What is it?" Colleen asked in confusion. To that question, Mark sat on a large rock by the riverbank and put Miracle on his lap. He started caressing her hair gently, which made the little girl squint her eyes in comfort. Emihan as usual sat on his shoulder. Mark then looked at Colleen. "Why do you want to become strong? Why do you want to be able to control Carla's abilities?" Colleen was surprised by the sudden question, but she immediately answered with resolute eyes. "I want to survive this world and help my father in the future. Also to everyone, I don't want to be a burden." Mark nodded hearing that and spoke. "It's a naive goal, but at least, you have a befitting one. Something you could work towards too." "What does it have to do with Edsel?" Mark then turned his head at the place Edsel walked as he left. "That guy doesn't have such goals. Not anymore." Colleen was still confused about the circumstances, but she knew that she should not ask too much since Mark stopped talking. As for Mark, what he had said was true. Edsel lost his goals already. Mark already heard his circumstances. Edsel was only an elementary graduate since he had to start working early and did not have much opportunity to build up friendly relations with people of his age. It was because her mother died a year after he graduated elementary school due to sickness. Since he could not rely on his relatives, he could only work on his own to live. He never met his father, and the only thing he had in life was Pearl. However, the event that night happened. Without anything to hold on to but his empty life, his only goal right now was to become stronger. Not for the sake of living or self-satisfaction, but just for the sake of being strong. And that was not a good thing. Although it could be said that Mark also had a hand at causing this. Mark had not seen any circumstances like this before. However, he had Fried's memories. The fallen king saw many people that ended up being consumed by their strength and fallen into bad circumstances. It would be bad if Edsel followed the steps of those people. The main goal of bringing Edsel this time was to make him realize this. While they were passing time, my lord, Emihan tried to say something but... Shish. Mark stopped her with a smirk. The tall grasses around the clearing near Colleen started rustling, which immediately alerted her. As she was about to jump away from her position, several figures jumped towards her and surrounded her. Several pointed wooden spears were aimed at her. Don't move, GG give us all your food and water. What an intimidating declaration. Mark tried his best not to laugh. Not only Mark but even Colleen did not know whether she should be scared with the spears pointed at her or laugh. However, laughing would be rude towards their cute assailants. After all, what surrounded and pointed their spears at Colleen were 7 children with ages about 5 to 12, and they all looked really desperate. Day 44 to 9:02 a.m. San Jose, Antipolo, Rizal. While the sudden assailants pointed their spears at Colleen, Mark just sat in place without moving. He stopped Emihan and Miracle from making a move, while he also made Chaflar, who was disturbed by the commotion, to stay put. There was really no need for any of them to make any move of retaliation. After all, it would be overkill to do so. On the other hand, Colleen was troubled. She looked at Mark with the expression asking, "What should I do?" "You should be able to deal with them, right?" Mark said, knowing what Colleen wanted to say. "Deal with them? You want me to kill them?" Colleen was flustered with Mark's words, but hearing her ask that question, the children around her flinched. These children were not bandits or anything of sort. Mark knew that. The way the children tried to threaten them was too amateur. The way the leading child stuttered as he spoke made it obvious that they were doing this for the first time. Even the way they surrounded Colleen was not organized. Some went out and charged first, while others did lag behind. The 7 children surrounding Colleen started to hesitate when they heard her words. They were all very nervous and would surely try to run away in the slightest scare. After all, they just heard that they would be killed. Among the 7 children surrounding Colleen, 6 were boys and 1 was a tomboy. However, these 7 were not all the children here. Behind the bushes there was still 4 more, and they were all girls. These children were surely naive. Although it was a smart move that they aimed for Colleen first in attempt to take her as hostage since she looked weaker, it was not a smart move to target the place with more people. They might have more percentage of succeeding if they tried to target Edsel first, but it seemed that they perceived him as dangerous since he was holding a weapon and had a gun when he went away. They did not even try to observe further, as it seemed that they did not witness the time Chaflar landed. They were totally oblivious that there was a dragon keeping silent near them. Mark did not say anything about killing the children, and Colleen just misunderstood it. These children were not enemies that would try to take their lives. They just wanted food and water and seemed desperate about it. However, since they pointed their weapons at Mark's group, there was no need to bother with them too much. Since Colleen did not want to make a move, Mark sent a mental signal to Chaflar. Roar. Chaflar slowly stood up and roared in a menacing manner. It was really an overkill. Uwahhhh, Mo monster. Run. Mama. The children's formation immediately collapsed. While some immediately tried to run away, there were those that were not able to. 2 fell on their butts as they stared at Chaflar wide-eyed and shivering in fear. 1 boy stood frozen as warm liquid flowed down his legs. The youngest, that was 5 years old, tried to run but ended up tripping on a rock and started crying while holding his knee. Behind the bushes, 3 of the girls plopped down on the grass and started crying, while 1 tried her best to not succumb to fear and started helping the others up to run away. It became a disaster. Only 1 boy, who was the oldest, stared at the dragon, facing it with all the courage he had. His legs and arms were shivering, but he positioned himself between the dragon and his friends. Mark. Colleen yelled in a fluster. She immediately ran towards the 5-year-old boy that tripped to help. "I did nothing though. It's Chaflar's fault." Mark feigned ignorance. Of course, Colleen would not believe him. "I'm sure you made it scare them." "What? You're not making a move, so it thought. You're scared stiff. I thought you want me to kill them. I said nothing of sorts though. HMPF. Colleen started to ignore Mark and focused on helping the crying children around her. It's Chaflar who scared them though. Mark shrugged his shoulders. It seemed that he was enjoying the scene. My lord, you're behaving badly, you know? Even Emihan could not help but admonish Mark. Even though she was still afraid of humans, the scene in front of them right now was just too much. Geez, all right. Mark then shouted at his pet. Chaflar, you can stop it already. Finally, Chaflar, who was staring at the shivering boy in front of him, went back to resting. The way it looked at the children was really smug. If Mark did not make it stop, it would probably push the children into fright even more. Seeing that Dragon did not attack and actually obeying the man in black clothes, he plopped onto the ground. Although he did not cry out loud, the corner of his eyes had tears. Boss. Is something wrong? Edsel finally appeared. The roar Chaflar made alerted him. He thought that there was danger and hurriedly returned. However, seeing the scene in front of him, he was not able to process it. He left with only their team in this place, but now, almost a dozen children were scattered, creating a huge ruckus with their wails of fear. What? Boss? He could only turn to Mark, but the latter only signaled to ask Colleen about it. It took several minutes and Colleen managed to pacify the children. All of them already gave up on robbing the unfamiliar people in front of them. Not only that they failed, but the other party even helped them calm down. Although they pointed their weapons on Colleen, but she still took their sides. Now, they hung their heads in shame. Not only they tried to rob people for the first time and failed, but their supposed victims ended up helping them. They really thought that they would die just earlier and could not help but succumb to fear. When Chaflar suddenly roared, they thought that they were being attacked again. 11 children now lined up in front of Colleen. Unexpectedly, even though the one who wet himself was rather embarrassed, he did not go to the river to wash, even though the river was just a few feet away. Why don't you wash yourself first? Colleen also noticed and asked. However, an unexpected answer came. He can't. It's dangerous, the eldest child spoke. Why? Colleen could not help but ask. The river water is harmful in this area. If we want to wash, we should go downstream. We still can't use the water for drinking or cooking though. Hearing that, Colleen shivered as she turned her head to Mark. It turned out that he was right, and luckily, he stopped her from washing her face with the river water earlier. But how could he tell? She could not help but think. Sensing her confusion, Mark spoke. Because there's not a single fish in the water in this area, there are no river insects either. The child further attested to it as he spoke. Fishes that will enter this part of the river and the area upstream would die. The fish downstream are also already too few and small. No wonder these children were desperate for food and even water. Still, if the river became like this, it was bad news not only to these children but also to Mark and a lot of people. Not only the stretch of this river run near his base, but also this river was the one that the military thought that would provide water for their new settlement. If the river became contaminated and harmful, it would be dangerous. When did it start? Mark could not help but ask, since it would also affect his base and the military settlement he had cooperated with. The child looked at him reluctantly and spoke. Just 2 days ago. No wonder it hadn't spread too much yet. Mark murmured. He thought that it had not happened for long, since the child had just said that they could still use the water downstream to some extent. It meant that the contamination had not spread too much yet. Did something strange happen that day? Colleen managed to catch up with Mark's thoughts and asked. Yes. It was about midnight before the river became contaminated. The sky was covered in thick clouds then. A bright red light appeared for several minutes in the forest upstream. It is really something strange. The red light covered the forest. Another child spoke, a girl about 8 years old. Mimi, don't be rude. The eldest child admonished the girl while glancing at Mark. Seeing that Mark did not mind, he felt relieved. On the other hand, Mark scratched his cheek. Father, he's scared of you. Even Miracle noticed in. It seemed that he really went overboard. In any case, it seemed that Colleen managed to get the hearts of these children. Are you all siblings? Where are your parents? Colleen asked. However, that question made the whole atmosphere down, sensing it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Is there any adults around? Hearing her question, the children looked at each other and started whispering in a circle. Colleen did not mind it though, but she wished that they would go a little farther since she could still hear what they were whispering about. Big sister, sirs. Can you help us? We have a few adults with us but they are sick and injured. After whispering, the eldest girl who seemed to be 11 spoke. As she spoke, the other younger children started to show their begging look and puppy eyes. Mark would notice what these cunning children were planning, but Colleen and Edsel was the issue here. My lord, can we at least check? Well, Amihan was another. While the children were showing those looks, a growling sound was heard. Some of the children hurriedly looked around to see if there was danger, however. One of the boys looked down in embarrassment. Sorry. It was his stomach growling in hunger. Mark, can we give them food and water? Colleen patted the boy on his head and asked Mark. That question made the children look at Mark with expectations. No. The children became downhearted. Now, even Colleen was looking at Mark with a begging look. Stop that, you idiot. Who's an idiot? Colleen snapped. Ignoring Colleen, Mark looked at the eldest boy. Bring us to where you all live first. I'll give you some food and water if you all did that. Of course, hearing that, it would not make them answer immediately. They did not know these people. Even though Mark said that he would give them food and water, they were reluctant to let strangers into their dwelling place. The children could not help but look at Colleen. You all don't have to worry. That guy might look like a criminal, but he's not bad. With those words, the children finally agreed, albeit reluctantly. They were really desperate right now and the opportunity finally came. In the least, they were not harmed and they failed to do an evil deed either. As for Mark, he really did not want to do this in the first place. However, the circumstances of this river could fatally affect his base. After all, the spring river in his base was also connected to Agos River. Although it was not connected by source and was just connected downstream, he could not take chances. To address the situation, he needed more information. However, children whose minds were not ripe yet would not be able to give him enough, and that was why she needed the adults. Fortunately, these children seemed to still have some guardians and not some vagabonds here. Still, just how severe were the condition of the adults for these children to go out and find food and water on their own? Day 44 to 9:32 a.m. San Jose, Antipolo, Rizal, a small town that was just slightly bigger than a large village. That was how large this place in the middle of nowhere. Yes, in the middle of nowhere, as it was surrounded by forests, mountains and rivers, and there was no other places inhabited by people nearby. The nearest place that inhabited by people was more than 3 kilometers away southwest of this town. There were no electrical posts, no asphalt and cement roads, and no water service. That was how modest this place was. Even before the outbreak, people in his place heavily relied on the river and the gifts of nature. After the outbreak, however, those remaining graces they had started to become threat to the lives of people living in this place. At the southwest side of town, a group of 12 children, 3 adults and a large lizard could be seen traversing the narrow pathways behind the bushes and trees. They moved while following the curve of the river that flowed south of the town. With the children in the lead, Mark carried Miracle while he walked with Chaflar behind the group. Edsel was moving at the center while Colleen accompanied the children in front. The children led the way on heightened alert. The older children were trying their best to detect if there were danger around as they moved, while the younger children stayed at the center of the group. They were totally immersed in being careful that they did not even realize that their guests were looking at them with bitter expressions. It seemed that these children even forgot that there was a dragon following behind them that could ward off any danger. They seemed to be used to this. Mark thought as he observed these children. With the younger ones in the center, It would be easier for the older children to move and protect them in case that something happened. Most children their age in the modern times would surely incapable of thinking formations like these. The children leading them, however, seemed too experienced in moving in groups like this. While they walked, Colleen took the opportunity to ask the children's names. The eldest, who was a 12-year-old boy, was called Tequila. The others were Mirasol, a girl who was 11 years old, Isco, a boy who was also 11, Pacifico and Igma, who were both 10-year-old boys, Nanita, the tomboy that was 9, Rubylin, a girl that was 8 years old, Rosaldo, a boy that was also 8, Mimi, the 7-year-old girl, Flordeliza, a 6-year-old girl, and the youngest, Gani, a boy who was 5. Because the children were too cautious, it took another 10 minutes before they arrived at the southeast edge of the town. Big sister, we live in that building. Gani, that was holding Colleen's hand, pointed at the building that could be seen behind the houses in front of them. It was a long 2-floor building with more than a dozen rooms. There was a wide open yard at the back of the building. The green roof of the building was too noticeable even from afar. In fact, everyone in Mark's group had seen this building before they landed by the river. It was because it was the largest building in this place. That's a school, isn't it? Colleen asked. Yes, that's our school. Returning to our houses is dangerous, Mimi and Igma said respectively. Follow us, quick. Tequila said with seriousness and rushed towards the schoolyard. For sure, they wanted to rush since the schoolyard was open and there was no place to hide. Chaflar, stay there. I'll just call you if needed. Mark made Chaflar stay behind the trees and bushes. Making Chaflar follow behind them would surely cause more trouble than good this time around. Of course, Chaflar followed without hesitation. Rather, it was too eager to stay behind. The group ran across the schoolyard. As Mark had seen from above before, the school was really just a single building. All the facilities and classrooms of the school were packed into this single building with about a dozen rooms. The schoolyard had no walls or fences and was totally open. The security of the school was almost non-existent. At least, the windows of the school building were secured with railings. The windows at the first floor looked broken though. Reaching the school building, everyone started climbing up the emergency ladders instead of entering from the first floor. Since it was hard for the 5-year-old Gani to climb up the ladder, Tequila made Gani ride on his back as he climbed up. It was also the same for Flordeliza, who was carried by Isco. Apparently, the lower floors were dangerous and as such, they barricaded the stairs securely, making the ladders as their primary way of entering and exiting the school building. They are back. They brought people. Mark could hear some commotion from above. He did not need to look up as he knew that there were 3 more children on the terrace of the second floor. Aside from the children, he could detect 7 more people and he was sure that those were adults. However, Mark felt strange. In the apocalypse, many people could take advantage of others, not to mention in a place like this. However, seeing that the children outside brought new people back, the ones left at the school seemed eager to welcome them. He could tell that it was genuine and there was no catch to their behavior. Still, it made Mark feel strange. Hearing the voices of children, Mark felt another stare from the second floor. However, when that stare landed on Mark and his group, the feeling of disappointment could be felt. It did not take long and the children finally finished going up to the second floor. Next was the turn of Mark's group. Colleen was the first to climb up while Mark climbed after her. Edsel climbed last as the rearguard. When they reached the second floor, a woman about the age of 25 approached Mark and his group with great difficulty. She was wearing an old blouse and a very long skirt that reached above her ankle. The woman was injured for sure as she was relying on a large makeshift staff to be able to walk. If she let go of the staff, it was possible that she would not be able to stand at all. Miss Genevieve, you should rest. Tequila, Mirasol and the other children hurriedly approached the woman. However, none of them tried to help her walk. Or rather, none of them dared touch her. It was obvious in the faces of the children that they were worried and wanted to help, but it seemed that they could not. It's fine, all of you. You brought guests. It will be bad if no adult welcomed them. The woman bitterly smiled at the children before she turned towards Mark's group. I'm sorry if there's no warm reception. I'm Genevieve Bellaflores. Genevieve tried to give at least good greeting, but her state was not really good. In response to her introduction, Mark let Colleen do theirs. As for Amihan, she was hiding inside Mark's backpack and there was no need to introduce her. Miss, are you okay? Colleen tried to approach and help her, however. Don't touch me, she yelled in panic and tried to back off. Because she was already standing unstably in the first place, she ended up falling on the floor. By reflex, the children approached her, but they all stopped when they realized that they were about to touch her. When she fell, her skirt was lifted a bit and her lower legs were exposed. It was horrendous. The veins on her lower leg were swollen and were totally red in color. It was as if she was growing red root like lichen under her skin. Realizing that her lower legs were exposed, her eyes became sad as she slowly covered the ugly part of her body. Without asking for help, she slowly stood up using her staff, ignoring the pain from the fall she just had. She turned to Colleen, who was shocked from being yelled at too suddenly. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to shout at you, it's just. It's contagious, isn't it? Mark interjected and Genevieve nodded. Before anyone could say anything else, Mark continued. Is it because of the water from the river? Yes. Genevieve confirmed it without hesitation. Please, don't be scared. It's not that contagious, but it's better to be cautious. She tried to pacify Mark's group, thinking that they might get scared, but looking at Mark, his expression did not change at all. Even Miracle on his arms only had a little confusion about the situation. Mark's guess was spot on. After all, the appearance of her legs was totally weird. It's bad to talk here outside. Please, follow me. Genevieve turned around and walked across the hallway of the second floor with great difficulty. As Mark had no problems with it, he followed behind her. The children surrounded the sick woman with worried faces, but of course, that was the only thing they could do. Passing across the second floor, most of the rooms were empty aside from 2 rooms. One had the other adults inside. They were all lying down the floor with just makeshift bedding under their bodies. They were all in a bad state. On the other occupied room, was 2 people fully covered with cloth. Those 2 were already dead. Mr. Emilio and Ms. Marychris died just last night. Tequila spoke when he saw Mark looking at the 2 corpses inside the room. The boy's eyes were gloomy. Not only him but the other children looked very sad. What is the relationship of you kids with them? Colleen asked. Our teachers. What about the other people in the other room? Tequila looked at the direction of the room. Only Mr. Philip is our teacher in there. The others were people living around the school before. We have 8 teachers before, but. Ending his sentence with those words, the boy looked outside the terrace as they walked. Mark, Colleen and Edsel also looked outside with interest. That was when they saw more than 24 graves neatly lined at one part of the schoolyard. After a while, the children departed to do their chores, leaving only Mark's group and Genevieve inside the room that seemed to be the principal's office. Sitting on the opposite sofas made of bamboo, Genevieve apologized once more about what happened earlier. By the way, you seemed disappointed when you saw us earlier? Is something wrong? Mark could not help but ask first, as he was rather disturbed by it. Genevieve seemed to be surprised, but she still answered. We are waiting for rescue, she said with dejection. You people are not rescuers, right? Yep, we're not. We are just stopping by to rest for a bit, but some children jumped at us to try and rob us. She apologized once more. It seemed that she was really used to it. Apparently, they have a group that left to call for rescue. The animals around this area became huge monsters and many already died. They were waiting for the rescue since everything started. However, it was already more than a month, but no one came. We just want to go home and leave this scary place. Genevieve's tears fell. They were teachers here, but it did not mean that they live in this place. In their case, they were visiting teachers in this area. They conduct lectures for a fixed amount of time and go home to the city during the breaks. Now, Not only they were trapped in this place, but they were on the verge of dying. It was like a scene from horror movies. She was rather surprised as to how Mark's group managed to come to this dangerous place. That made Mark realize there was no electricity and no communication lines in this place. Mark looked at the teacher in front of them and asked seriously, "You shouldn't expect any rescue arriving. Do you have any idea what is happening in the world right now?" Genevieve was stunned and confused at the sudden question. Day 44 to 10:09 a.m. San Jose, Antipolo, Rizal. What do you mean? Genevieve forced out that question from her confusion. Looking at Mark's serious face, she started to have a bad feeling. She thought that these people the children brought here were people that came from the nearest villages and managed to come here by chance. They were not the first people to have those circumstances after all. About 2 weeks ago, a family arrived here after their village was decimated by animals that turned into monsters. Of course, that family was not here anymore. Learning that the circumstances in this place were the same as where they came from, they decided to try their luck further and left. As for them that remained here, it was not because they did not want to leave, but rather, they could not. They tried to leave before their situation became this dire, but the dangers they encountered in the way pushed them back here. Not only that they had to return to being trapped in this place, but they also lost people, mostly children. Out the almost 200 students of this school, only 10 were left, and the more than 50 adults that managed to survive the initial attack of the monsters, only 7 were left. More than a week ago, 5 of their strongest men volunteered to go and find rescue. If it was just them, it was easier to escape from danger and fight since they had no need to protect anything else. That was the last they heard of those men. However, this place was too far from the city in the first place, and they who were left here trapped could only pray that those men would reach the city and send help. Since animals became monsters, even if it also happened to other places, areas with a lot of people should be able to fend off those monstrosities. Or that was how it was supposed to be in their minds. The world has ended already. Mark's words made the poor teacher stare at him with disbelief. With Colleen's help, Mark told Genevieve gist of the events that happened this past month. The plane crashes, the infected, the mutation and the survivor settlements. Genevieve did not say anything all the while and just listened while staring at Mark and Colleen in a daze. At the end of the story, the teacher was totally silent while staring at the coffee table in front of them. Seeing her state, Mark spoke. "You seem awfully calm." Finally, she lifted her head and looked at Mark, but her eyes still blank. It seemed that she was in the middle of believing and disbelieving what Colleen and Mark had just said. I just don't know how should I react to this. It might be hard for these to sink into you mind, but remember that it's all true. You all better give up on waiting for rescue since no one will come. If you had people that left to call for help, they should be dead already. Not only there are dangerous animals here in the forests, even if they managed to reach the city, the only things they could encounter are the infected. Either way, they will die. Genevieve became silent once more. It was very hard for her to accept the things she had just heard. Nevertheless, she could totally confirm that those were not lies. She could not think of any motives these people in front of her could have for them to spout such lies. Furthermore, they already saw animals turning into monsters. The zombie-like infected, and the end of the world was not very unlikely. Seeing the dazed state of the teacher, Mark decided to leave her alone and went out, dragging Colleen out of the room. The dazed teacher did not even react to their group going out. "Will she be fine?" Colleen asked as they went out of the room. "She won't. It might not sink in immediately, but it will be a hard blow for her." She was really hopeful that someone would come to rescue them, but reality is just that harsh to everyone. Mark replied as he led the way back to the rooms where the sick were located. "Reality is harsh to everyone," Edsel murmured. Those words hit him home since he was also a victim of it, a poor victim of harsh reality. Reality, it was a formidable foe for everyone who had high expectations about something but failed miserably. Mark wanted to ask the teacher about things, but he never expected that the people here were this ignorant about the happenings of the world outside. Now that the teacher still needed some time alone, he could only do his investigation on his own. On the way back, he noticed several figures below the schoolyard. Despite the danger outside, several children were there. The younger ones were on the lookout while the older ones. They were digging new graves. Edsel, go and help them. Yes, boss. I'll go too. Colleen volunteered. All right, you two go. Also, Colleen, you can distribute some of the dried jerky on that bag you were carrying. Okay. Wait. What about you? I just have some things to do. Just go if you want to help them. Making the two go away, Mark continued walking through the hall with Miracle on his arms. Soon, they arrived at the room where the sick were being kept. No one should enter here. Ah, you are. The middle-aged stout-bodied woman inside immediately noticed Mark the moment he came into the room. After all, she was the only one that could notice him since she was the only conscious person in the room. She was facing the other way and thought that a child came barging into the place they should not go, but she was surprised when she turned around. This woman was the same. She was not wary about strangers at all. If this was your typical survivor hideout in the city, the moment a stranger entered into their room, murderous eyes would surely be pointed at them. However, the people in this place had not experienced the hardships of the survivors in the city. Furthermore, they were too happy to see new faces, alive. It was despite how Mark more or less looked like someone who could commit crime anytime. We are passing by when the children spotted us and brought us here. Ah, yes. I saw your group with Miss Genevieve earlier, but you shouldn't go in here or you might get infected. It will also be dangerous to your daughter. The woman warned Mark with concern. After all, this place was where the remaining adults that were all sick were being kept. We'll be fine. Actually, I want to ask questions. Is that so? Then, we can talk outside. The woman stood up. Of course, it was with difficulty. Like Genevieve, she was also infected. Furthermore, hers was worse since not only her legs and feet but her arms and hands also had those swelling red-colored veins. In the least, the state of her legs was still better as she was able to stand and walk without the need of support. They stood in the hallway overseeing the schoolyard. The woman was surprised seeing Edsel and Colleen trying to help the children, but she could only smile with gratitude. It's been hard to those children, she murmured before she turned to Mark. Where is Miss Genevieve? She's back in the office thinking about something. I see. What do you want to ask then? Then, madam, it's about the contamination in the river. Hearing that, her expression became bitter. Did anything strange happen before the river become contaminated? The children already told us about the red light in the forest to the north, but I don't think that it's all. Mark pressed on. Just call me Amy. Being called madam is too high-classed for me. About the strange things, that red light is just the start of it. Amy then narrated things that happened that day. The animals that turned into monsters often appear, and that was why they rarely come out. However, those enlarged animals could still be felled and become source of food with the use of some traps and weapons. It was not because they wanted to eat them, but they had no other choice. That day, however, the clouds were too thick. They thought that it would rain, and as such, they wanted to get more game in case that it really did rain. If it rained, the forest would become more dangerous and they would not be able to find food. Since people in this place mainly relied on hunting, fishing and gathering for food in the forest, there was very little that they could gather around to keep. To hunt more animals before the rain fell, all the remaining adults went out. There were still 15 adults at that time. It was not really that dangerous as long as they did not enter deep in the forest, since all they needed to do was lure the animals towards the traps they laid beforehand. However, that bright light appeared disrupting their hunt. They all felt scared and decided to retreat, but they were late. From the direction where the light came from, ferocious animals started rampaging. The animals caught up to them, and some of them did not manage to escape, while a number of the ones who escaped were injured. When we escaped that time, we thought that it was over. Some of us died, but we are already used to it. Actually, some of those graves there don't have bodies inside but just the belongings of the deceased. We can't go back and retrieve their bodies after all. When they thought that they were already safe, They came to the river to wash their bloody bodies. Mostly, those that were wounded wanted to clean their wounds. That was a fatal mistake. The water was already contaminated and the parts of their bodies that touched the water felt painful midway. They could not help but rush out of the water, but it was already too late. Miss Genevieve was lucky that she went to the river late and she just reached the shallow part, but those that washed their bodies, they caught the worst part. Up to that point, Amy looked at the room behind them. Those remaining inside were those that were injured and the water from the river entered their wounds. They were the ones in the worst condition. She then looked at the other room where the corpses were being kept. Mr. Emilio and Ms. Marychris were the most injured at that time. The infection spread faster in their bodies and they did not make it. It won't take too long and we will all follow them. Amy then raised her unsightly arms in front of her. The first day, it's only my hands up to my wrist, but now, it's nearing my elbow. Is it really contagious? Unfortunately, yes. Amy replied with a sad expression. The children that took care of us in the first day got infected. We think that anyone who get in touch of our body fluids could get infected easier. Hearing that, Mark did not ask anything about those infected children. He could only detect sick adults inside the room. Meaning, those children had already gone first. Anyway, did anything else happen way before that? At least, a story, folklore or an incident in that forest where the bright light came from? Let me see. Actually, we had stories that spirits live in that forest and that was why the trees there were very abundant. They said that going there would make the spirits angry and that is why none of us go to that place. Amy said while thinking. Ah! Amy exclaimed as she remembered something. More than a month ago, just before the animals turned into monsters, a small airplane, I think, Ms. Genevieve said that it could be a private jet. Something like that crashed in that forest. Hearing that, Mark knew. He had found the information he wanted. Day 44 to 10:28 a.m. San Jose, Antipolo, Rizal. Mark finally learned about the most probable reason of the contamination. Any aircraft flying around the world crashed after the meteoroids exploded in the atmosphere 43 days ago. That was because the sudden entrance of high concentration of mutagen on Earth hit them and turned the people aboard those aircrafts into infected monsters and other unsightly things. However, there were still some things that did not fall into place. If the people aboard that plane were really the cause, why did it only happen now? Furthermore, the people here in this town seem to have never encountered any infected people. As Mark thought further, his eyes widened. Is it perhaps related to that? Sir, is there something wrong? Amy asked as she saw Mark's expression. With her question, Mark turned back to her. It's nothing. Did you people check the area where the airplane crashed? We didn't. Amy shook her head. No one from our town would dare to venture inside that forest. We also don't know the exact location of the crash. All we could do was to send people to inform the authorities. Amy then fell silent. Those people, surely, no one managed to return. From her silence, it was likely that one of her loved ones were among them. Soon, some steps could be heard from their side. Managed to sink it in? Mark spoke without looking. He knew who the person was in the first place. It's hard, but I can manage. The person replied. Her voice was wavering and sounded rough. Miss Genevieve, what happened? Amy asked as she looked at the teacher. Her eyes were red and she seemed parched. It was obvious from her looks that she had just finished crying. Seeing the teacher's state, Amy suddenly turned towards Mark. What did you people do? Of course she would be suspicious. Aside from her sickness, Genevieve welcomed them fine. Now, something happened for sure from the current state of Genevieve. Amy, stop it. They didn't do anything bad. Then why? They just told the truth. The worst thing we could hear right now. Genevieve tried to smile but she was not able to. What truth? Amy was confused. You two better do that later. Mark interjected between the words of the two. When they looked at Mark's face from the side, they saw that his face was too serious as he stared at a certain direction. He then took out a pocket-sized radio from his belt. Colleen, Edsel. From the second floor, Mark saw Edsel and Colleen stop what they were doing as they heard Mark's voice from the radio. "Boss. Mark. Why use the radio? You can just shout, right?" Two voices interjected one another from the radio Mark was holding. "Make the children evacuate. We got company." "What?" The two were surprised. One reason was because they suddenly have enemies at a strange time. According to the things they learned from Mark's base, feral evolved animals were more likely to attack during the night unless prey wandered near them during the day, which was less likely to happen in places inhabited by people. Even though they were aggressive, they were not totally mindless. This early in the day and was about to approach noon was a very unusual time if the enemies were feral animals. From Genevieve's story, the only threat they had in this place was the number of animals that turned into monsters, which for sure meant evolved animals. Another thing that surprised the two was Mark's unusual serious tone as he told them about the threat. The two then heard Mark's admonishing tone. "You two stop gawking around. The enemies this time is unusual, it's better to retreat first." Hearing his shout, the two immediately moved. When the children learned that there were enemies coming, they immediately complied on evacuating. The younger children ran first towards the school while the older ones moved with Edsel and Colleen from behind. "Sir Mark, what is going on?" Genevieve asked. Hearing that enemies were coming, she could not believe it immediately. After all, there was no danger on site even though they were on the second floor. "Sir, are you sure about?" Amy also tried to ask, but she was not able to finish her words. Running from the northern side of the town, there were several horrendous-looking creatures. "No way, my God," Amy and Genevieve could not help but gasp seeing those creatures. Mark glanced at the two. From their expression, it seemed that this was not the first time for them to see such creatures. They seemed to be more surprised about the quantity and not the creatures itself. "You encountered those creatures before?" "Yes." Genevieve's voice was shivering because of her emotions. "Those were similar to the ferocious animals that attacked us the other day," Amy said. Running between the houses, trees and bushes at the north, many figures of animals could be seen running. Despite Genevieve and Amy could not get a clear figure of the enemies, they knew those familiar characteristics. Mark on the other hand frowned seeing those figures. For sure, they were evolved animals. However, he could not tell whether they were feral or not. They were several kinds of animals. There were boars, deer, civets, macaques and even birds. Even insects were present in the group. In Mark's estimate, there should be about more or less 60 to 70 of them. The smallest was about the size of a dog while the largest was the size of a horse. Still, even though there were a large variety of the animals and insects, all of them were running on the ground. Mark could not tell if the insects were the same, but all the animals were bald. They totally lacked fur or feathers from their bodies. One thing was consistent among all the animals though. They all have red lichen-like things sprouting all over their bodies. As for the animals and those insects that had softer bodies, the swellings on their bodies were prominent. It was the same symptoms prominent to those who were infected by the contamination in the river. The very same symptoms the sick people in this building had. Mark then noticed that each of the animals and insects had bulging sacs on different parts of their bodies that seemed to be releasing heat and smoke. Those bulging sacs even looked like that they were pulsating. The only difference the enemies from the sick people. The question most people would think was why these animals would suddenly attack now. However, Mark had a vague idea. "Emihan, it seems that they are here for you." Mark suddenly spoke, calling a name Genevieve had not heard before, making her turn to him in confusion. She remembered that his daughter was called Miracle, so he was not talking to the little girl. Then, Emihan flew out of Mark's bag, shocking the two sick women. "Wah, what?" The two both stepped back but did different reactions. Genevieve stared wide-eyed in shock, but Amy kneeled on the floor looking at Emihan in reverence. Both Mark and Emihan ignored the two and stared at the incoming enemies. "What do you think?" Mark asked. "My lord, it had similar presence to one of my kind, but it's all reeking of miasma. Probably one of my kind that turned into an evil spirit or something similar." That person should have felt my presence here, my lord. I'm sorry. The frown on Mark's forehead became even deeper. It was a tricky situation. Although he just wanted to investigate a bit, it seemed that their group appearing in this place put the people here in more danger. Mark then felt a small hand straightening the frown between his eyebrows. Father, Aunt Effie said, it's bad to frown too much. Seeing the warm scene, Genevieve and Amy should have smiled if not for the current situation. With the panicked voices of the children below, the two could not pay too much attention to the scene, and even Amihan was neglected by Amy as she stood up once more. Everyone, run faster! Genevieve shouted towards Edsel, Colleen and the children running away. Even though they were all running as fast as they could, the children's short legs could not take them away any faster. The two women on the second floor of the school started to feel nervous. On the schoolyard, everyone could already see the enemies surging from the other side of the earthen street. Some of the animals were already crossing the street and was about to step into the schoolyard. TSST, 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 TSST. Edsel had already prepared his silenced assault rifle and started shooting as they all retreated. Some of the children flinched as they heard the sudden gunshots as it echoed badly on the open area. Ignore the gunshots. Run. Colleen immediately pulled the children back from their stupor and pushed them, urging them to run away. Bam. Spurt. Blag. Different sounds were heard as the vanguard of the animals fell after being hit by the gunshots. Some of them were directly hit on their head while most were hit on different parts of their body. Many of Edsel's shots missed the target. He was still not too experienced with guns with just 1 or 2 days of a few hours practice. This became a fatal flaw this time. The injured animals slowly gained their footing once more, and strange enough, those that were hit on their heads were also the same. None of the animals remained unmoving and still charged towards the school despite their bleeding bodies. As he saw what happened, Edsel fired his rifle even more. However, it was obvious that he had already lost his cool. His shots became even more inaccurate, and rather than stalling the enemies, the noise he was making caused the enemies to charge towards them faster. The situation was becoming more and more dangerous. Quick, climb up! Colleen shouted as she helped the smaller children climb up the emergency ladders. Still, their speed was not enough. Ignoring their sickness, the two women dragged their bodies towards the direction of the emergency ladder. It seemed that they have at least a countermeasure for something like this. The two women grabbed a roll of manila rope hanging near the ladders and started to lower the rope. The two covered their hands with thick rags that seemed to be used for cleaning windows so that they would not touch the rope directly. Seeing the rope, the children started to tie the lowered rope to the bodies of the smaller children, and the two women would pull them up. This way, the time needed by all the children to climb up would be shortened as their numbers was reduced. Still, the bodies of the two women were considerably weakened by their disease. Amy's arms seemed to be in extreme pain as she frowned with tears on the corner of her eyes, but she did not let the pain stop her. But then, the two became surprised as they were pulled back by the rope. The two could not help but look behind and saw Miracle pulling on the rope, which gave the common sense of the two a huge blow. You two should just rest. Just give it to her, Mark said with a nonchalant attitude. But, just let go. You two will just get in the way. Mark said that with a tint of intimidation. The two finally let go of the rope, and Miracle started pulling the rope on her own, which further widened the eyes of the two. Furthermore, the little girl was pulling it up with very little effort. She even seemed to enjoy pulling the rope as if she was playing. Amihan, guard this place, especially Miracle. Yup, no problem, my lord, are you going? It's our fault that these things appeared here, so I have to make a move. If not for that, we could just leave this place and go find the source. With that, Mark removed his backpack, revealing the darkness shade, set on his back, and put the backpack down. He then jumped off from the second floor, making the two women nervous as they hurried to see Mark below. Seeing that Mark landed fine after jumping down, they felt a bit relieved. However, the two women were now questioning themselves whether they were dreaming or not. After all, They were being besieged by nightmarish creatures, and the people they met just now seemed to be nightmarish in a sense too. Of course, the nervousness of the two was just the start. As they saw Mark face the incoming creatures, they could not help but shiver. Day 44 to 10:32 a.m. San Jose, Antipolo, Rizal. Mark landed with ease after he jumped from the second floor. After landing, the first thing Mark did was, "Stop that already, you're wasting bullets." He grabbed Edsel's shoulder. The young man did not even realize that he already arrived behind him and was continuously shooting the incoming animals. When Mark grabbed his shoulders, he flinched as he snapped away from his current state. "Boss, you need to keep you calm even if death is approaching you. Otherwise, you won't even notice any opportunity to survive even if there is one." Edsel fell silent. He still needed to learn a lot of things. His legs were even shaking from the scary scene in front of him. He might be able to handle one or two enemies, but this many pushed him into fear. "Retreat first. You can back me up from the second floor. Also tell Colleen to watch out for the ones that will go straight to the school. The target of these guys is Amihan." "Yes, boss." Hearing Mark's orders, Edsel finally retreated and helped Colleen in assisting the children to go up. "It's better if no one will drag me around this time," Mark murmured with a serious expression as he watched the incoming animals. He was also not confident in being able to deal with these creatures with efficiency. What was harder? Was it fighting people? Maybe, fighting the infected. Was fighting evolved animals harder? Or fighting these beasts? For Mark, it was the fourth one. These beasts exhibiting the same symptoms as the people that were the hardest enemies he faced so far. He knew that these beasts were still alive. However, their consciousness and instincts were all wiped out. In other words, these beasts should not be capable of moving at all, as they were all in a state of coma. Yet, these beasts were moving. It was something similar to the infected by the unstable strain of mutagen. No, it definitely had to do with mutagen. Everything in the world had already been altered by mutagen ever since the start of the outbreak. With Mark's emphatic ability to detect and absorb emotions, he had a high advantage against humans and animals. As for the infected, even if they had no emotions, their movements were mostly monotonous and easy to predict. These beasts in front of Mark, however, were the combination of the two. The enemies now had no consciousness but exhibited the physical prowess of those that had consciousness. Furthermore, there were several more things he was wary about these beasts. But he had no choice right now but to fight. Making his first step, he charged forward. He then dropped the angle of his body as he ran, and at the same instance, a bladed baton launched forward from the shield on his back. As the baton passed over his head, he immediately grabbed it with his right hand and swung it to the side. With that swing, bladed baton turned into a long spear, the blader. In this fight, what he needed to do the most was to avoid getting too close to these beasts. As they had the same symptoms of the contamination, it was very likely that they could also transmit the disease. A single careless move could be fatal. In that case, he should fight while maintaining distance as soon as possible, and this spear and his needle launcher were the best weapons to use. There were only a few steps before he would clash with the first beast. He then held the blader with two hands and positioned it with the blade of the spear in front. It was a typical spear charge. Still, Mark was in doubt whether it would be effective. It was a large deer about the size a little smaller than an adult thoroughbred horse. However, its antlers looked like stone spears. Anyone pierced with its horns would surely suffer a fatal injury. This deer was charging forward with its antlers pointing in front of it. Antlers are bones, so, Mark murmured as he suspected something. Antlers were made of bones. If its antlers looked like tough solid stones, then how strong the bones of this deer were. He decided not to continue the initial attack he wanted and pointed his spear a little downwards. Then, he suddenly stopped his running, causing the force and speed from his charge to push him forward. With his left foot forwards and the right foot behind, he let his feet skid through the soil until the deer was already within the reach of his spear. Since the spear was pointed downwards, the blade passed below the head of the deer. With a stomp, Mark stopped sliding forward. He then let his right hand let go of the spear and hit the hind side of the shaft with his right palm downwards. With his left hand as fulcrum and his palm as the effort, the spear was used as a lever. Bam! As the previously lowered edge of the spear suddenly swung upwards with the force enough to crush a normal person's skull, the lowered head of the deer was blown upwards, revealing the area underneath its jaw. With his fast reflexes, Mark pulled the spear back and pierced it forward with more force. Splat! A hole was punched through underneath the deer's jaw. The spear evaded the strong bones of the deer's skull and its blade went straight into the deer's brain. With the blood splattering around, Mark hurriedly retreated. He then swung the spear to the side to free it of the remaining blood and charged towards the other animals. Still, Mark was not relived at all even though his attack at the deer succeeded. It was because the deer stood up once more even though its brain was already done for. However, Mark managed to get the attention of the whole horde of contaminated beasts. As Mark thought, these beasts were being controlled remotely. He only succeeded at injuring one of them, and yet, the whole attention was on him now. If it did not happen, he would have thought that these animals were some sort of voodoo or magical zombies that had no weaknesses except being burned to ash or being sliced into unrecognizable pieces. For sure, whoever or whatever was controlling these beasts, he found Mark as a threat. Bam! Mark hurriedly jumped back as a dog-sized grasshopper hopped and landed to the place he was standing previously. Shing! Shing! As he dodged the sudden attack, metallic sounds echoed from the blade of his spear as one side of the blade stretched down to a quarter of the length of the spear shaft. Mark then jumped forward and rotated the spear 2 times as he passed over the body of the grasshopper. After he landed behind the grasshopper, its body fell down with its dismembered legs scattered around it. Since they won't die, disable them first, Mark said as he charged towards the other animals nearby. However, it was not easy to attack after that, and Mark started to fall into defense. All these animals were connected to one another, and what one saw were seen by the others. He was losing the opportunity to attack. The beasts swarmed at him continuously. It's amazing how he was able to dodge all those attacks, but will he be fine? Genevieve could not help feel both amazement and worry. All the children already managed to get to the 2nd floor of the school building unscathed with Colleen and Edsel. It was all thanks to the effort of Colleen and Miracle along with Mark stalling the contaminated animals. They were all currently watching the situation below. The children were all noisy cheering for Mark. Children were children after all. Right now, what they see was not just a person but a strong hero that had inhuman strength and reflexes. Despite their cheers though, the worry was present. Mark was in a disadvantage with him alone, and if he fell, they would soon follow. He should be fine. Colleen spoke as she readied her assault rifle. Mark hasn't even displayed a quarter of his abilities. Besides, he's not alone. After removing the cloth that covered the rifle and fiddling a little, she aimed her rifle while using the concrete half wall on the terrace's leverage. Compared to Edsel's, her rifle looked different. It had a lot of necessary attachments and the outside appearance was customized. This rifle was given to her by her father when they met during the evacuation. It was a normal rifle with attachments back then, but with the help of Alana, Hallie, Mark and the blood children, the outer appearance of her rifle was customized. It was like a gun with a sci-fi skin from online games. Some of parts of the guns were even glowing. It was like a toy but deadly. Furthermore, its ammunition was not normal either. TSST. She fired the first shot. The green-coated bullet flew and hit the wingless dog-sized mosquito that was about to attack Mark from behind. Because of the mosquito's soft abdomen, the bullet pierced through and hit another animal, a wild boar that was beside the mosquito. Both the animal and the insect should have been fine since it was a superficial wound. However, before the two managed to make another step, they both fell down and their bodies started to twitch. It could not be seen on the mosquito, but the wild boar's mouth started to foam. The wounds caused by the bullet started to fester. Poison. It was a very deadly one. The bullets Colleen was currently using were coated with a very thin film of blood metal, from Ivy, the poisonous blood child. Despite the minuscule amount of blood metal on the bullets, a single bullet was enough to kill a perfectly healthy cattle in several seconds. It was the very reason why, aside from Mark, Miracle and the other blood children, no one else should touch Ivy. Edsel, take some bullets from the bag. The poisonous bullets seem effective. Oh, okay. With Colleen's order, Edsel hurriedly switched the bullets of his assault rifle. After reloading his gun, Edsel started to shoot the animals. Since he was not confident about his shooting skills, he aimed for the ones quite a distance away from Mark. He was not Colleen, who had a military major for a father. He did not even have one in the first place. With the help of the two, Mark finally had some opportunity. He then pulled the sleeves of his jacket, revealing two smaller needle launchers on both hands. Since the bigger needle crossbow could not be hidden inside his jacket, he made smaller ones but had shorter firing range before he left the base. When both needle launchers were out, he rotated the needle cases on the inner edge of the bracers where the launchers were set up, switching the ammunition to poisonous ones. Since he saw what happened after the two fired their guns, he now knew what to use. Unfortunately, the blader was not equipped with any poisonous blades or attachments. The numbers of the animals were steadily dwindling. Since the number of bullets they could carry inside their bags were limited in the first place, it was good that even though the beasts were quite a number, it could still be handled. Edsel was still wasting ammunition, though. Colleen, on the other hand, was rather a good shot. With the rate that the enemies fell, it would not take long before they were wiped out. Still, Mark was having a bad feeling for some reason. He could not help but focus on the direction where these beasts came from, thinking that there would be reinforcements. It would not be surprising if there were, because this number of animals and insects were too little for a big forest. Then, as if having a last struggle, the remaining animals all jumped towards Mark in very fast speeds. He had nowhere to run. With that, he had no choice but to use the move he was hesitating to use. Poof! Mark vanished into black mist, and the wavy mist escaped from the circle of beasts. But then, bugshk! The swelling on the body of a festering animal he passed by burst open, splattering red viscous liquid around. And a part of that liquid managed to land on his body. It was despite he was inside the subspace and traveled as mist outside. The liquid was supposed to phase through his body. When Mark appeared outside the circle of beasts, he was holding his right hand that was splattered in red liquid. Day 44 to 10:51 a.m. San Jose, Antipolo. Rizal, feeling the pain on his hand, Mark hurriedly and forcibly waved his hand to the side, causing the majority of the red liquid to fly off and splatter on the ground. He then ripped a part of his shirt and wiped the remaining liquid on his hand and threw the cloth away. Looking at his hand, the part splattered by was damaged despite the fact that he immediately cleaned the liquid. A small part of his right palm and the majority of the back of the hand, along with his ring and pinky finger, was scorched black and were even emitting black smoke with a very pungent smell. He also noticed that the dirt the liquid was splattered and the cloth he had just thrown away turned black and were also emitting the same kind of smoke. Mark frowned. This was the third time he received an attack while inside the subspace of his shadow mist movement. First were the thorns released by the black barnacles covering the 60-feet whale. The second was the bullets Sherwin specifically prepared to deal with him, while this was the third time. However, two of those three had the same thing in common. The energy these things had. Mark still had not confirmed before it, but he had the same feeling about the thorns and this red liquid. Now that he saw this black smoke, he could finally tell. It had something to do with miasma. He could not really see the energy, but he could feel it strongly. Now that the miasma materialized in the form of that smoke, he managed to deduce it further. Goo! Mark retreated and clutched his hand even more. His fingers were cramping and his hand started to move on its own. He could even see the blood vessels in his hand starting to swell and turning red in color. It was the same symptom of the contamination. Furthermore, it seemed to be several times more potent than what the sick people in the school had. The worst part, the being that was controlling these beasts was trying to control his hand. This could be a good opportunity to shout, "Calm down, my right hand," like some kid with a certain syndrome. Of course, there was no way he would do that. It was both pointless and embarrassing. If it was other people, it would have been a dangerous situation. The contamination would surely spread in several minutes or worst, seconds, and the person would be one with the beasts being controlled. Unfortunately for the enemy, burst. The contaminated parts of Mark's hand and fingers burst open and the contaminated flesh and skin fell onto the ground. With the contaminated flesh gone, a gaping wound was left on his arm. Some parts of his bone could even be seen. Along with the flesh and skin, quite an amount of black-colored blood also splattered down to the ground. He controlled his blood inside his hand and severed the contaminated parts. Since the blood he used to remove the contaminated parts also got contaminated, he pushed the contaminated blood out, causing the bloody scene. Mark's forehead started to perspire as he endured the pain. His bloody hand was even shivering, but at least, it was just a normal reaction now. Fortunately, this wound would heal soon as he was given enough time. His absurd regeneration rate was not just for show. Of course, it was still painful. If possible, he would never do something like this again. Furthermore, regenerating chunks of missing flesh and skin was not too easy. Since he could not use his right hand, he had to let go of his spear and returned it to being a baton and stored it. He needed to bide time first until the wound was healed and would use the needle launcher on his left wrist for now. He then started running around avoiding the attacks while shooting the needles accurately. With the shadow mist movement being unusable for now, he could only try to not let himself get surrounded. He's injured. How? Colleen became wide-eyed when she saw what happened to Mark after he used his shadow mist movement. She already saw at first hand how Mark was invincible to bullets while using that ability. Since she had accompanied him for a while now, she also learned things about it. This was the first time she saw Mark getting hit while using that ability. Rewinding the scene, she saw Mark vanish after he was attacked by the surrounding beasts without a way of escape. Then, the usual wavy mist appeared in his place and the mist moved out of the encirclement. As the mist passed over one of the dead bodies, the swelling burst open and splattered that red liquid. At that time, she saw the mist vanished a bit and she saw Mark's blurry body for a split second before the mist continued and Mark appeared. The scene as the red liquid splattered made her remember a stone was suddenly thrown into the water, causing the water to be pushed downwards, and if the water was shallow, it would reveal the bottom of the water for a short period before the water returned. While Colleen and Edsel were shocked at Mark receiving that injury, Genevieve, Amy and the children were all shocked at the scene where Mark vanished and appeared. They all could not help but gape their mouths, although it was not the appropriate time for gawking. Everyone then heard a cute voice shouting, "My lord, don't use that for now. The miasma will corrode any energy humans deemed as supernatural. Not only that the energy will be corroded, but it will also strengthen the miasma." Amihan shouted with worry. Her voice was amplified and was heard by everyone in the area. She seemed to be using the things Mark taught her well. "You should have said that earlier," Mark shouted back, causing Amihan to flinch. "Did you just say miasma? Yua?" Colleen could not help but blurt out that question, which caused Amihan to be taken aback. Sorry. You said miasma, right? The one that caused by evil spirits?" "Yes." Hearing that, Colleen's expression became serious. She turned to Edsel. "Edsel, stop shooting and help me refill the empty magazines. We need to kill these things faster." "Oh, okay." Edsel was flustered. This was the first time he saw Colleen this serious. With all her attention on the enemies, Colleen sped up, taking the beasts out. Soon, before Mark's wound could fully heal, all the beasts that came attacking fell using the poisonous needles and bullets. This time was quite dangerous as he could not use his shadow mist movement. Nevertheless, he managed to learn something. Miasma. It could be the very weakness of not only his ability but also other psychic and magical powers. The battle had just ended and the schoolyard was littered with dead corpses of huge animals and insects. Before everyone could breathe in relief, however, "My lord, get away from there." Amihan's panicked shout reverberated inside everyone's ears. Mark also felt something dangerous, and at the same time as the little sylphs shout, he jumped back and retreated. Splat! 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 Under everyone's eyes, the large swelling on the bodies of the animals burst open, splattering the red liquid everywhere. As for the insects, their bodies burst out entirely. Black smoke permeated the large part of the schoolyard. Even though Mark was outside the area covered by the smoke, he still felt suffocated and had to retreat even more. Guhaa! Gah! But then, anguished cries entered everyone's ears. Colleen, Edsel, Amihan and the children could not help but turn their heads towards the source of the cries. Their eyes turned wide in shock. Genevieve and Amy were both crying in pain as they slumped to the floor. Their painful screams could cause anyone to feel chills in their spine. Then, their bodies started to bloat and red lichen-like substance burst out of their bodies. Miss Genevieve, Aunt Amy, teacher, Aunt Amy. The children cried out in horror. They hurriedly tried to approach the two adults, but "Stay away. Don't approach us. Go away." The two women suppressed their anguished cries and shouted at the children. Looking at what happened to the beasts at the schoolyard, they knew their end was approaching. Puh! Black blood started to drip from Genevieve's mouth, but she still tried to look at Colleen and Edsel. "Please, take the children away." With tears at the edge of her eyes, Colleen nodded and stopped the approaching children. Edsel did the same, and his expression was very unsightly. The children wept out loud and kept calling the two women's names as they were pushed away. Dakila, knowing that it would be the last time they would see their teacher. "Teacher, Aunt Amy, thank you for keeping us until now." With his voice in the lead, the other children echoed. Hearing those voices, Genevieve and Amy cried. It was black blood that came out of their eyes, but they were surely crying. The two smiled at the children. Burst. Their bodies exploded. It was good that the children were pushed away, or else the red liquid that suddenly burst out of the two women's bodies could have contaminated the children. Amihan also helped by making a barrier of wind to push away the splattered liquid. The wind was weakened because of the miasma, but it was able to defend the children. Not only the two women, but several splatters could be heard from the room where the sick people was kept, and two bursts could be heard from the room where the corpses was placed. The younger children slumped on the floor and cried, while the older ones tried to keep their cool since they were the only ones left to take care of the others. Colleen consoled the children while Edsel was at a loss on what to do. Amihan was affected by the children's cries and also wept, but her attention was mostly on the schoolyard. Marks saw everything that happened at the second floor. It was really unexpected that the deaths of these two came too sudden. Now, the children were left on their own prematurely, and the reason was because Mark's group arrived here. However, it was not the time to sympathize with them. The children might have lost their guardians, but that was not the pressing issue. Not only the corpses of the beasts were emitting black smoke, but also the bodies of the adults that died inside the school. Furthermore, some of the graves on the other side of the schoolyard also started to emit that same kind of smoke. Still, the smoke was not moving upwards or scattering outwards. All the smoke was moving toward the center of the corpses of the beasts that littered the schoolyard. The materialized miasma started to gather and thicken. It even started to form a large whirlwind. There was no wind blowing around, but the gathered miasma kept spinning around. The area covered by the whirlwind started to become larger, and the smoke finally started to spread. Mark stared at the whirlwind as if waiting for something. Then a large shadow flew above the school. The shadow covered a large area, and its wings tried to blow the smoke away from the school. Looking up, it was Chaflar who Mark finally called. Mark had not called unto the dragon before, since it was still an animal. One mistake could lead it to being controlled by the enemy. Now, however, he had no choice. The smoke was spreading, and he needed something to blow the smoke away. Since it was a thick concentration of miasma, it was very questionable if Amihan's ability would work, and he could only call unto Chaflar. With Chaflar's large wings, gusts of wind started to push the spreading smoke away. The miasma still tried to spread, but without wind helping it, The wind Schaffler's wings could only push the whirlwind of smoke further away. The smoke from the surroundings finally thinned and disappeared, but the concentration of miasma in front was still spinning. Suddenly, Mark's eyes widened. Schaffler, burn it quick. With the order, a huge burst of flames came out of Schaffler's mouth and swallowed the concentration of miasma whole. Day 44 to 11:03 a.m. San Jose, Antipolo, Rizal. Extreme heat permeated to the air surrounding the schoolyard. Even Mark had to retreat further due to the heat. In his order, he might have just said a few words, but at the same time, he sent another order to Schaffler through their mental connection. That order was not to hold anything back. Schaffler emptied more than half of the chemical it had just regenerated in this single attack. Mark was detecting a deep animosity coming from the concentration of miasma in front. Since he was able to feel such emotion, he knew that something appeared at the center of the smoke. With such strong energy that even made Mark's eyes go wide, something dreadful was coming. Despite the unbearable temperature coming from Schaffler's attack, Mark was not contented. 2 crystals floated in front of him as he concentrated. Then, a beam of light and a flash of lightning tore through the wall of flames and flew straight towards where Mark was detecting the unsettling feeling. Even though the attacks became weaker than he expected, both attacks still pierced through the flames and miasma and even hit the old houses on the other side of the dirt road. TCH. Schaffler. Retreat. Mark shouted, and he himself retreated closer to the school building following the dragon's retreat. Whoosh. The miasma burst forth, quenching the flames that surrounded it. After the flames were extinguished, the scattering miasma started to vanish. A shadowy figure was left in place of the miasma. Everyone stared at the figure with an unexplainable feeling in both their hearts and minds. The shadowy figure was shaped as a humanoid 7 feet tall. Its body was kind of disproportional due to its limbs being too thin compared to its normal-sized body. Still, the feeling they had, it was unexplainable, but they knew that it was a bad feeling. Mark scrutinized the figure silently with his eyes looking sharp and wary. The figure in front of them existed, but for some reason, he felt that it did not exist either. It was there but not there. It was both dead and alive. It stood in front of him, but it also felt that it did not. The feeling was strange and confusing. The figure raised its head and looked at Mark. He could not help but step back. It just stared, but he felt like he was being drawn by it. The eyes of the figure were just a black shallow holes, but it gave a feeling of immeasurable deepness, as if it was a bottomless hole. It was something similar to a psychic character that became filled with animosity and started to destroy everything. Emihan, is this the one controlling those beasts and caused the miasma? Mark shouted without taking his eyes away from the unmoving figure. My lord, I apologize, but I can't tell. The miasma is too thick and unstable. Emihan replied in trepidation. This was the first time she was able to encounter something as dreadful as this. Even the evil spirits that killed her parents could not even amount to this one. While Mark and the figure stared at each other, the figure tilted its head and raised its right hand. Several fist-wide bursts of miasma rushed towards Mark in fast speed. The burst immediately surrounded Mark, leaving him no way to react. But then, Mark's eyes glowed, alternating with both red and violet color. As if hit by something, the figure staggered, making the attacks slower. Then, the number of the bursts of miasma doubled. The new ones, however, appeared ahead of the already existing attacks and had almost non-existent appearance. Using the opportunity, Mark moved between the attacks and faced the blurry figures without worry. He was hit by the blurry attacks, but the attacks just phased through his body. The next attack followed the same trajectory, but Mark had already dodged it. Mark then turned his head towards the shadowy figure, and with his eyes flashing a bright deep red light. The light was too bright that it looked like small red flames on his pupils. As Mark dodged the attacks, some of the attacks hit the school building behind him. The parts of the walls hit by the miasma turned black as if scorched by flames. Some of the bursts of miasma flew towards the second floor, causing everyone to run away. Even Schaffler had to hurriedly flew back to avoid some of the attacks. Luckily for them, Mark was the initial target, enabling them all to dodge. If not, it was likely that they were hit by the miasma directly. Colleen, Edsel, Emihan. Get the children and ride on Shaflar. Get away from here. Mark shouted as he made Shaflar retreat at the same time. This enemy was very dangerous and they would just hold him back. It was impossible to escape altogether. If they did, it was likely that the enemy would chase them. In the first place, the enemy was floating in place and its feet did not even touch the ground. Someone needed to stay behind and stall this thing, and he was the only one capable of that. How about you? Colleen shouted back. Don't ask questions and just go, will you? HMPF. Colleen felt a bit offended at Mark's reply, but her eyes still looked worried. However, Mark already gave his orders and his words were absolute in this trip. It was one of his rules for bringing them in this journey. With her lead, everyone started to evacuate the school. While everyone left in the school started to evacuate, Mark and the shadowy figure continued their confrontation. Bursts of miasma continued to attack Mark while he dodged every attack desperately. Father. Be careful. My lord. I can't confirm, but it might just be a manifestation and not the real body. Its body is made of miasma, so please, don't get hit even once. Mark heard Miracle's and Amahan's voices as Shaflar took off from the school. The direction the dragon was flying towards was their base that should be southeast from this place. He ordered Shaflar to deliver the children to his base. Of course, it was possible that they would not be able to make it in one go, but it was better than staying here. Seeing the escaping dragon and humans, the figure tried to float higher but only to suddenly stagger backwards. It turned to the human that stayed behind in overwhelming anger. On the other hand, the human was glaring at him with red eyes. RRRRUUUAHHHH. The shadowy figure released a loud sound that sounded both like a roar and a screech. More bursts of miasma rushed towards Mark, who evaded the attacks as if he was predicting the trajectory. Mark managed to dodge the barrage of attacks by using his newly acquired ability, Flash Precognition. Still, sweat started to trickle from his head as he continued to use the ability. Not only that he had not done any practice using the ability since he had just acquired it, but the expense on mental energy was overwhelming. Furthermore, the miasma around was draining his energy even faster. Whoosh! Another set of attacks moved towards him, not leaving him any chance to dodge due to the speed. However, his eyes glowed red once more and glared at the figure, causing it to stagger backwards. The bursts of energy moving towards him slowed down, allowing him to use his Flash Precognition and dodge. Since Mark was detecting emotions from the enemy, he figured that it could get affected by his empathic ability, and he succeeded to some extent. The bursts of miasma were being controlled by the figure directly, as if some remote-controlled missiles. With Mark disrupting its control, he was able to dodge the attacks. Still, the situation was too dire and should not continue. Furthermore, another problem was starting to rise and Mark could only grit his teeth. The amount of animosity the figure was exuding was more than what his empty consciousness could handle. His mind was starting to get affected. Mark started to lose his calm and his eyes even started to exude the same animosity towards the enemy. Staring at the ethereal figure of the enemy, Mark started to charge towards it with the lights in his eyes alternating in color. Mark then shot a poison needle towards the figure. Of course, it was ineffective and the needle just passed through its body. As Emihan said, it's just a manifestation. Mark kicked sidewards, avoiding another attack, and circled around the enemy. As he did that, the figure staggered as it received another mental attack from Mark. When it recovered after a second, it only saw a black mist rushing towards the north, leaving it behind. RRRUUUAHHHH. It floated higher and chased after the black mist and launched another burst of miasma. As the miasma hit the subspace created by his shadow mist movement, Mark was forced out of the subspace. However, he did not stop running towards the north. He ran around houses, trees and other obstacles, causing the enemy to lose track of him several times, and he activated his shadow mist movement to gain distance. Although he was forced out every time, he was still able to create some distance between him and the enemy. He also used optical camouflage, but stopped soon as he noticed that the enemy could detect him just from the energy. The optical camouflage also looked distorted due to the presence of miasma. Mark continued to run even though he was already panting due to the massive expenditure of mental energy. He had already stopped using his empathic abilities and concentrated on flash precognition to read the attacks and dodge it as he ran away. He was running towards north, which seemed to confuse the enemy since the others escaped towards the south. Seeing that it was hard to catch Mark, the enemy stopped chasing and was about to turn back. For sure, Colleen and the other were easier to catch than Mark. But then, Mark shouted, which made the shadowy figure stop. "You're just a manifestation, right? I wonder what will happen if I destroyed your real body." Mark smiled sinisterly as he provoked the figure and ran away afterwards. RRRRRUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUUU Now wonder that Mark started running towards the north direction. It thought that he was fleeing, but he was actually trying to look for its true body. Absorbing the intense bloodlust and animosity, Mark's nose started to bleed. There was also a metallic taste and feeling in his throat. His eyes turned red, but for a different reason. "Rahhhhh!" Mark roared as he resisted the influence of the bloodlust and animosity he continued to absorb without pause. It was the worst characteristic of empaths. They had no control to what or how much emotional energy they would absorb from the surroundings. It was already amazing that he was still able to resist this much. Normal empaths should have already turned berserk just from the initial outburst of animosity from the enemy. Finally, Mark reached the northern border of the town. Not far, he could see the edge of the forest that should be where the source of this mess could be found. As he reached the forest, he hesitated to enter. It was because red lichen spread out on the forest floor. There was no doubt that the main body of the enemy was in this place. Still, it was unnerving seeing the contamination spread out this much. Nevertheless, he had no choice. He took out 3 crystals and the crystals floated around his wrist. Since the forest was lush and the sunlight reaching the forest floor was too little, Mark activated the lightning mental crystal to provide light, and he controlled the light generated with the photokinesis mental crystal. A circle of high-temperature light surrounded the ground by his feet with him in the center. The light burned all the lichen Mark passed by. Then, Mark activated the Stormcaller mental crystal. Slowly, clouds started to surge above the forest. With the preparations and protections activated, Mark rushed towards the deep areas of the forest with the enemy chasing behind him. He could not maintain all of these for every long time. Mark needed to hurry even more.